If you have ever driven the Lincoln Highway east from Port Augusta into Whyalla, South Australia, 2 kilometres before the city centre, you have seen her. HMAS Whyalla. 56 metres of grey steel hull, Bathurst-class corvette, beached 2 metres off the ground. 2 kilometres from the sea. Here is the contrast that defines this story. In 1984, the Whyalla City Council paid the Victorian Public Works Department $5,000 to buy that corvette back. In February 2025, the Australian and South Australian governments committed $2.4 billion Australian dollars to rescue what was left of the city that built her. 66 ships were built at Whyalla between 1941 and 1978. 1,800 men lost their jobs at the closure. Japanese shipyards held 50% of the world's commercial shipbuilding market in 1975. A London-based metallurgist named Sanjeev Gupta arrived in Whyalla in 2017, promising a green steel future. By 2025, the UK Serious Fraud Office was investigating Sanjeev Gupta for fraud, fraudulent trading and money laundering. And the South Australian Parliament seized the steelworks back from him in 15 minutes. If you have ever driven through an Australian industrial town and wondered why the lights went out, hit subscribe. This channel keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. The Corvette Beside the Highway. Saturday morning, 2026. The Lincoln Highway. Spencer Gulf glinting to the east. The flat saltbush country of the Eyre Peninsula stretching west to the horizon. The temperature is 22 degrees. The road is empty. 2 kilometres before you reach the centre of Whyalla, you see her. HMAS Whyalla, J153. 56 metres of grey steel hull, 3 battle honours stencilled on her funnel. Pacific, 1942 to 1945. New Guinea, 1942 to 1944. Okinawa, 1945. Bathurst-class corvette, Australia's first South Australian-built warship, beached 2 metres off the ground, 2 kilometres from the sea. The Whyalla Maritime Museum surrounds her, opened around her by the Whyalla City Council on the 29th of October 1988. 6 years after the council had bought her back from the Victorian Public Works Department in late 1984 for the sum of $5,000 Australian dollars. $5,000 Australian dollars. She was launched in this very harbour on the 12th of May 1941, yard number 8 of the BHP Whyalla Shipbuilding and Engineering Works. The first hull, the first warship. Across the next 37 years, 65 more ships would slide down the 5 slipways behind her. The slipways are now empty. The Whyalla Shipbuilding and Engineering Works closed in August 1978. The fitting out wharf is empty. The plate shop, the frame shop, the foundry silent. Behind the corvette, on the far side of the dual carriageway, the BHP Whyalla Steelworks. The integrated steelworks she made possible still smokes. Blast Furnace Number 2, relined in 1981 and again in 2004, still in operation. In February 2025, the South Australian Parliament passed emergency legislation in approximately 15 minutes to seize that steelworks back from its private London-based owner. The Australian and South Australian governments committed $2.4 billion Australian dollars to keep the city alive. This is the story of the Australian deepwater shipyard that built 66 ships across 37 years, the Japanese combine that destroyed it, and the modern London metallurgist who almost finished the job. Chapter 2. Essington Lewis and the BHP Indenture Act. Broken Hill, New South Wales, 1885. The Broken Hill Proprietary Company is incorporated as a silver, lead, and zinc mining venture in the western New South Wales desert. March 1915. BHP opens its first steelworks at Newcastle, New South Wales. 1921, Essington Lewis is appointed BHP Managing Director. Lewis, born at Burra, South Australia, on the 13th of January 1881, would dominate Australian heavy industry for 40 years. 1934. Lewis returns from an extended tour of Japan, convinced of the inevitability of a Pacific War. He writes the famous notes on Japan, a private memorandum to the BHP board predicting Japanese military expansion within a decade. 1936. Lewis forms the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation at Fisherman's Bend, Melbourne. He secures a pilot munitions plant at Newcastle. 1937. The South Australian Parliament under Premier. Sir Richard Butler passes the BHP Indenture Act. 1937. Providing the legislative basis for BHP to construct a blast furnace, a deep-water harbour and a shipyard at Whyalla, South Australia, on the western shore of the Spencer Gulf. Why Whyalla? Geography. Iron ore from BHP's Iron Knob mine, operated since 1899, 40 kilometres west, deep-water access on Spencer Gulf, flat ground for slipways, a railway line from Iron Knob to Hummock Hill already in place since 1901. 1939. BHP, in the wording of its own corporate history, agreed to enter the shipbuilding industry for defence purposes. Construction of the shipyard begins. 5 slipways planned, slipways 1, 2 and 3, built in 1939, slipways 4 and 5 added in 1940. The 11th of June, 1940, 1 week after the evacuation of Dunkirk. Prime Minister Robert Menzies appoints Essington Lewis as Director General of Munitions. Lewis refuses to take a salary from the Commonwealth. June 1940, the first shipyard order is received. The keel of HMAS Whyalla is laid the following month, on the 24th of July 1940, while the yard itself is still being built around her. The 5th of April 1940, a small newspaper called the Whyalla News publishes its first edition, the literal voice of the new industrial town born alongside the yard. And on the 12th of May 1941, the wife of the Governor of South Australia, Lady Barclay Harvey, swung a bottle of champagne against 56 metres of grey steel, and Australia's first South Australian-built warship slid down yard number 8 into Spencer Gulf. Chapter 3. HMAS Whyalla, Yard Number 8, the 12th of May, 1941. Spencer Gulf, the first launch, the first of 66. HMAS Whyalla, Bathurst-class corvette. Yard Number 8 of the BHP Whyalla Shipbuilding and Engineering Works, 56 metres long, displacement 650 tonnes standard, 1,025 tonnes full load, twin-shaft triple expansion steam engines, 3-inch gun forward, 2-pounder pom-pom aft, 3 Oerlikon 20mm cannons, depth charge throwers, minesweeping gear. Launched on the 12th of May 1941 by Lady Barclay Harvey, wife of the South Australian Governor Sir Malcolm Barclay Harvey. The crowd on the slipway, more than 2,000. The crowd in Whyalla itself, most of the town. Standing beside Lady Barclay Harvey on the launching platform was the man who had built the yard, Mr. H.T. Kleeman, BHP Whyalla Superintendent. A BHP company man, recruited from the Newcastle Steelworks, sent to Hummock Hill in 1939 to oversee construction of 5 slipways on flat saltbush country where no shipyard had ever existed. Kleeman is the named yard insider the record gives us from the founding era. His wife would launch the 4th corvette before the year was out. Here is a small footnote. The intended name had been HMAS Glenelg. The launching ceremony reassigned the name Whyalla at the last minute. The city would have its corvette, and the corvette would carry the city's name to the Pacific. Commissioned on the 8th of January 1942, under Lieutenant Leslie N. Morrison, R.A., N.R.S. 3 further Bathurst-class corvettes followed in 1941 from the same Whyalla slipways, HMAS Kalgoorlie, launched the 7th of August, 1941. HMAS Gawler, launched the 4th of October, 1941. HMAS Pyrie, launched the 3rd of December, 1941, by Mrs. H. T. Kleeman, wife of the BHP Whyalla superintendent. Read that again. The superintendent's wife, the same family that had run the yard from the day the first slipway was poured. 4 corvettes in 7 months from a yard that had not existed 2 years earlier. Days after the HMAS Whyalla launch, BHP's first blast furnace at Whyalla was blown in, May 1941. The steelmaking that would, 24 years later, become the fully integrated Whyalla Steelworks. And from the moment she was commissioned on the 8th of January 1942, HMAS Whyalla went to a war that had already arrived at Australia's front door. Chapter 4. The Patriotic Debt. 3 Battle Honours. January 1942. HMAS Whyalla begins convoy escort duties along Australia's east coast. 31st of May 1942. HMAS Whyalla is in Sydney Harbour the night 3 Imperial Japanese Navy Type A Ko-Hyoteki midget submarines penetrate the harbour boom net. The depot ship HMAS Kutabul is torpedoed against the wharf. 21 sailors die. 12 days later, HMAS Whyalla is escorting a southbound convoy when the freighter Guatemala is torpedoed and sunk by Japanese submarine Mi-21. She is the only ship lost in any convoy HMAS Whyalla escorted across the entire Pacific War. December 1942, HMAS Whyalla deployed to New Guinea. Convoy escort. Hydrographic survey work. Lead up to the Battle of Buna Gona. 2nd of January 1943. Near missed by Japanese dive bombers in McLaren Harbour, New Guinea. 2 crew wounded by shrapnel. 14th of April 1943. At Milne Bay during a Japanese air raid by approximately 100 aircraft. HMAS Whyalla assists in rescuing the crews of damaged sister corvettes HMAS Kapunda and HMAS Wagga. June 1943. Refit at Sydney. February to June 1944. Anti-submarine patrols off Sandy Cape, Queensland. June 1944. Redeployed to New Guinea. December 1944. HMAS Whyalla becomes part of the British Pacific Fleet's 21st Minesweeping Flotilla, redesignated B252. Minesweeping. 1945. Manus, the Philippines. Okinawa. For Operation Iceberg in March to June 1945. Brief Hong Kong service after the Japanese surrender. Operation. Returned to Brisbane in October 1945. Paid off on the 16th of May 1946. 3 battle honours. Pacific 1942 to 1945. New Guinea 1942 to 1944. Okinawa 1945. Battle. And meanwhile, the Whyalla Yard's commercial wartime work begins. Iron Monarch 2 launched October 1942, 8,158 tonnes dead weight. Iron Duke on 2 launched the 3rd of May 1943. 5 river-class freighters for the Australian Shipbuilding Board through 1943 to 1945. Whyalla's total town population was barely 5,000 by 1943, up from a few hundred in 1939. The wartime shipyard workforce was in the thousands, men and women on day and night shifts. The World War II women workforce numbers are not in the index public record for Whyalla. The State Library of South Australia's J.D. Somerville Oral History Collection holds the names that were never in the Advertiser. They are not online in 2026. Women. 3 battle honours. Built in Whyalla. Built by a workforce that had not existed 5 years earlier. And by 1976, the city that built her had grown to 33,000. Built. Chapter 5. The Foundry, the Plate Shop, the Slipways. To understand what Whyalla lost in 1978, you have to understand what Whyalla was in 1965. Not the political abstraction, the physical place. The Whyalla Shipbuilding and Engineering Works occupied 1,000 hectares on the western shore of Spencer Gulf. 5 slipways, each capable of building ships up to 15,000 gross tonnes. A workforce of 1,407 men in 1962, including boilermakers, fitters and turners, shipwrights, plate workers, welders, riveters, draftsmen, apprentices, labourers. Walk into the plate shop on a winter morning in 1965. The smell first. Hot-rolled steel from BHP's own rolling mill on the same site, 600 metres away, brought in on internal rail. For 2 decades, the Whyalla yard had built ships from Newcastle steel and Port Kembla steel. But from 1965, the steel came from across the road, the plate cutting bay, oxyacetylene torches, the smell of burning steel, the shower of orange sparks against the concrete floor. Steel plates cut to template, marked with chalk numbers, lifted by overhead crane to the frame shop. The frame shop. Ribs and frames bent to shape on the steel floor. The floor itself a casting 1 metre thick. The heaviest single floor casting in any Australian shipyard. The slipway itself, a vast concrete ramp angling down to the waters of Spencer Gulf. The keel laid first, a single backbone of welded steel plate. The frames raised next, on either side. The plating of the hull, plate by plate, riveted in the 1940s, welded by the 1960s. The first all-welded ship at Whyalla was Iron Dampier, launched in 1960. After Dampier, the rivet guns of the 1940s were gone. The welders had won. The launching crew, known across the yard as the ground crew, were the most experienced shipwrights in the yard. They worked the timber launching cradles, the steel drag chains, the tallow on the slipway timbers. The launch was a public event. The Whyalla news covered everyone. Thousands of locals watched from the harbour wall. The schoolchildren of Whyalla had a half-day holiday for major launches. The photographs in the Whyalla news show them in school uniforms on their father's shoulders. April 1970. The half-built 66,800-tonne tanker Amanda Miller catches fire on the slipway. The Whyalla news headline ran across 2 pages. The ship was eventually launched in 1971 after extensive rebuilding. The siren marked the rhythm of the yard, 7:30 in the morning, 12 noon, 3:30 in the afternoon, 6 o'clock for the night shift. The migrant tradesmen of post-war Whyalla, Italian, Greek, Yugoslav, British, built the ships of the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s. Their names sit in the BHP Whyalla. Apprentices' Handbook held at the Noel Butlin Archives at the Australian National University. Their oral histories are in the J.D. Somerville Oral History Collection at the State Library of South Australia. Most of those records are not online in 2026. What does exist is one written account from inside the yard. Roy Kriegler, a sociologist who hired on as a labourer in the Whyalla Shipyard in the early 1970s, worked the yard for 2 years to write his doctoral thesis and published Working for the Company, Work and Control in the Whyalla Shipyard with Oxford University Press in 1980. It is the only book-length first-person account of life inside the Whyalla yard. Kriegler described the noise of the rivet guns, the heat of the welding bays, the steel underfoot, the sweat. By the early 1970s, perhaps 2,000 to 2,500 men at peak. Among the apprentices on the plate shop floor in the early 1970s was a 17-year-old Whyalla boy who had just left school. His name was Edward Joseph Hughes. He walked through the BHP gate on his first day and did not walk back out for 50 years. Eddie Hughes, apprentice, tradesman, councillor, Member of Parliament, would, in February 2025, vote on the floor of the South Australian House of Assembly to seize the steelworks back from a London metallurgist who had never set foot on a Whyalla plate shop. But in 1973, he was 17, holding a chalk template, learning how to mark a steel plate for the oxyacetylene torch. Chapter 6. The Migrant City, from Liverpool to Forsyth Street. Whyalla, after 1945, was not a town. It was a built city, built by the South Australian Housing Trust, planned by the Department of Lands, populated by working-class British migrants and continental Europeans. The South Australian Housing Trust built approximately 500 houses per year through the mid-1960s. In 1966 alone, over 600 houses were built in Whyalla. The migrant communities arrived in waves. British from Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, from 1947. Italian after the 1951 Assisted Passage Agreement. Greek after 1952. Yugoslav after 1965. Vietnamese after 1975. 1st of November 1961. Whyalla is officially proclaimed a city. Population 14,076. The peak decade was the 1960s. Whyalla's population doubled, from 14,000 to 30,000 across 10 years. Two named locals carry the texture of that decade. Lynette Ruth Raymond was born in Whyalla on the 28th of March 1951, daughter of Keith Raymond and Ruth Stevens, originally from the Cornish copper mining town of Cadena, who had married in Adelaide in 1943 and moved to Whyalla as the shipyard expanded. As a child, Lynn sat at the family dining room table, listening to her father, his brothers Ken and Douglas, and her grandfather Ray, talking about Labor politics. She would, in 1997, become the member for Giles in the South Australian Parliament, the seat that includes Whyalla. In 2010, she became the first female Speaker of the South Australian House of Assembly. In 2016, she became Mayor of Whyalla. Whyalla born, Whyalla raised, Whyalla elected. Peter Stanley arrived from Liverpool in 1966, aged 10. His father had taken a job in BHP's diesel locomotive repair shop. The family came out on the assisted passage £10 scheme. Stanley's account from his 2017 essay, Diminishing City. Whyalla was booming. BHP's steelworks had opened the year before. The shipyard's orders book was healthy. In the decade of the 1960s, Whyalla's population doubled from 14,000 to 30,000. In our first year there, the Housing Trust constructed over 600 houses. The streets of the 1960s. Whyalla, Norrie Avenue, Nicholson Avenue, Forsyth Street, where the migrant fruit shops opened on Saturday mornings. Essington Lewis Avenue, named after the BHP managing director who had built the yard in 1939. The Whyalla News, published since the 5th of April 1940, ran the wedding announcements, the football scores, the launching photographs. Every shipyard worker's daughter who got engaged. Every Italian migrant family who opened a fruit shop on Forsyth Street. Every Greek wedding at the Hellenic Club, the Whyalla Yacht Club on Spencer Gulf, the Whyalla Steelers football team, the Whyalla Italian Club and the Hellenic Club, Stewart High School and Westland Primary. May 1965. The Whyalla Steelworks is officially opened by South Australian Premier Frank Walsh of the Labor Party. The first fully integrated BHP steelworks in South Australia. Iron ore from Iron Knob, smelted at Whyalla, rolled at Whyalla, shipped from Whyalla. The Department of Lands in 1965 planned for a city of 100,000 by the year 2000, and by 1976, with the steelworks running at full production and the shipyard at full output, Whyalla had reached its peak, 33,000 people. The largest industrial city in South Australia outside Adelaide. Chapter 7. The peak, 33,000, 1968. BHP Whyalla's combined workforce, steelworks and shipyards, reaches 6,950 men. 1969. The pellet plant and coke ovens come online. The Whyalla Steelworks is fully integrated. The 1962 baseline split from the Whyalla City Council's own records, 2,301 at the steelworks, 1,407 at the shipyards. The shipyard's golden decade, chronological, as the hulls slid down the slipways. 1964, Musgrave Range, Yard 38, Australian National Line. 1965, Darling River, at launch, the largest Australian-built ship. 1967, Ocean Digger, a submersible oil drilling rig. 91 metres by 111 metres by 62 metres. Hollow legs that could be flooded for stability on the seabed. Australia's first submersible oil rig built in Australia. 1970, Yarra River, Yard 45, ANL. 1971, Amanda Miller, 66,800-tonne tanker, relaunched after the 1970 fire. 1972, Clutha Capricorn, yard number 53. Approximately 83,000 tonnes, the largest Australian-built ship ever at her launch. Steam turbine, single screw. Bow sections 3 and 4 erected on the 19th of February. Launched on the 12th of May 1972, 31 years to the day after HMAS Whyalla. The launch photograph of Clutha Capricorn, fitted out and ready for sea trials, was sent to the Maritime Archives by the senior figure who had run the yard through its peak, Ross Hawke, BHP Whyalla. Shipyard General Manager and Naval Architect, Hawke is the named senior shipbuilder the record gives us for the 1970s peak. The man whose signature appeared on the working drawings of the largest Australian-built ships of the era. 1973. Iron Monarch, Yard 54, Row bulk carrier. 1974. Iron Duke, Yard 56, Row, christened by Mrs. J. McNeil, wife of the BHP Managing Director. The tanker Arthur Phillip of 1974 passed the 1 million tonne milestone of total merchant output from the yard. 1975. Seaway Prince, the world's first gas turbine electric-powered ship. The Whyalla yard in 1975 was technically at the global frontier of merchant marine propulsion. And by 1976, peak population 33,000. The recursive anchor of this entire story, the largest industrial city in South Australia outside Adelaide. The third largest city in South Australia, after Adelaide and Mount Gambier. The Whyalla City Council in 1976 was projecting the population to reach 50,000 by 1990. The Department of Lands had planned for a city of 100,000 by 2000. It would never reach 35,000. By the time Peter Stanley's father retired from the diesel locomotive repair shop in the early 1980s, the city had begun to decline. By the time Stanley himself returned to Whyalla in 2016 to research diminishing city, the city had lost 1 in 3 of its residents since the peak of 1976. And in Tokyo, the Japanese shipbuilding combine that already controlled half the world's market was about to apply the cost pressure that would close the Whyalla yard in 2 years. Chapter 8. The 50%. Japan overtook Europe in 1956 to become the world's top shipbuilder by market share. By 1975, Japan held exactly 50% of the world's commercial shipbuilding market. Read that again. 50%. One country, The other half of the planet shared the rest. 7 Japanese majors accounted for approximately 70% of Japanese output: Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Nagasaki, Kobe, Yokohama. IHI, Ishikawajima Harima Heavy Industries, Tokyo, Aoi, Kure, Yokohama. Kawasaki Heavy Industries, Kobe, Sakida. Nippon Kokan, Tsurumi, Tsuzu, Fukuyama. Mitsui Engineering and Shipbuilding, Tamano, Chiba. Hitachi Zosen, Sakai, Maizuru, Enoshima. Sumitomo Heavy Industries, Uruga, Yokosuka. And here is the kicker. Whyalla's own technical partner from the early 1960s was IHE of Tokyo. The technical cooperation agreement signed between BHP's Whyalla Shipbuilding and Engineering Works and Ishikawajima Harima. Heavy industries in the early 1960s gave Whyalla access to Japanese welding techniques, Japanese hull design, Japanese productivity methods. And it tethered Whyalla commercially to the country that would, within 15 years, outcompete it on every tanker contract on the world market. The Japanese cost advantage on bulk carriers and tankers, 30 to 40%, cheaper steel, cheaper labour, higher productivity, government subsidies through MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, under what was called the Kaizen National Strategy. And then the world changed, the 1973 oil crisis. OPEC quadruples oil prices. Global tanker orders collapse. Japan's available shipbuilding capacity peaks at 9.0 million CGT in 1975. By 1990, 5.5 million CGT, a 39% reduction. The structural collapse forced Japan to dump tanker tonnage on the world market at marginal cost. Australian yards, Whyalla, Newcastle State Dockyard, Cockatoo Island, Williamstown Naval Dockyard, could not compete on price. 11th of November, 1975. Gough Whitlam dismissed by the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr. 13th of December, 1975. Malcolm Fraser elected. Treasurer Philip Lynch, 1975 to 1977. 1976. The Fraser government commissions the Industries Assistance Commission, the IAC, to review Australian shipbuilding subsidies. September 1976. The IAC reports. 22nd of September 1976, Senate Hansard. The Minister for Industry and Commerce concedes on the floor of Parliament. We all know that there is no doubt that if the IAC report is accepted, the shipbuilding industry has a particularly bleak future. The IAC's evidence: days lost per 1,000 employees in 1974, total Australian manufacturing 2,975. Newcastle State Dockyard, 26,500 days lost per 1,000 workers. The industrial relations record was used to justify the withdrawal of subsidy, and on the 31st of March 1978, the Canberra Times reported that the Whyalla Shipyards would close by the end of July, that the last ship would be a BHP coal carrier called the Iron Curtis, and that 1,800 men would lose their jobs. Chapter 9. Iron Curtis, the last ship, 31st of March, 1978. The Canberra Times runs the closure announcement. The final ship, Iron Curtis, yard number 64, BHP coal carrier, launched in January 1978, handed over to BHP in August 1978. The yard wound up in the second half of 1978. 1,800 redundancies at closure. Read that again. 1,800 men. Boilermakers, plate workers, fitters and turners, welders, shipwrights, electricians, draftsmen, apprentices, labourers. A workforce that had taken 37 years to assemble, dispersed in less than 6 months. The exodus from Whyalla began within weeks. The skilled tradesmen left for Newcastle, Port Kembla, Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne. Some went to the new Pilbara iron ore ports. Some went to the offshore oil rigs of Bass Strait. Some went home, back to Italy, back to Greece, back to Yugoslavia. Roy Kriegler, the sociologist who had hired on as a labourer in the early 1970s, who had spent 2 years inside the yard documenting what it was, published his book 2 years after the closure, Working for the Company, Work and Control in the Whyalla Shipyard, Oxford University Press, 2080. His closing chapter title, written from inside the wreckage of the yard he had personally worked, was 4 words long: Company Town to Ghost Town. Kriegler's analysis of the yard's final years documented in the careful language of someone who had swung the hammer himself an intractable dynamic of alienation, a malaise of lack of commitment that infected the city as well as its industrial workplaces. The phrase has not aged. Company Town to Ghost Town. The Whyalla News reported the final launch, Iron Curtis sliding into Spencer Gulf for the last time. The crowd on the harbour wall was the largest since the launch of Clutha Capricorn 6 years earlier. The school children had their half-day holiday for the last time. Eddie Hughes was 22 when Iron Curtis launched. The apprentice who had clocked on at the BHP gate 5 years earlier watched his trade die in real time. Of the 1,800 men who were made redundant, Hughes was one of the lucky ones. He moved across the road to the steelworks. He kept the BHP pay packet. He never again worked a slipway. The yard that had hired him at 17 was gone before he turned 25. Paul Mazurek, who would become the Whyalla Maritime Museum's curator and South Australian Historian of the Year in 2022, summarised it from 2024 in one sentence. When BHP closed the Whyalla Shipyards in 1978, it led to an exodus of skilled workers and their families from Whyalla. Many predicted this would be the end of Whyalla, but as we know, the steelworks is still going now. The end was not the end. The steelworks kept smoking, but the city never recovered. By 1986, the 33,000 of 1976 had become 25,000. By 2001, 22,000. By 2021, 21,000. A population collapse of approximately 1 in 3 across 45 years. But 4 kilometres south of the abandoned slipways, the BHP Whyalla Steelworks kept smoking. And in 1984, a small group of Whyalla volunteers paid $5,000 for a corvette. Chapter 10. $5,000 and a lighthouse tender. Late 1984. The Whyalla City Council pays the Victorian Public Works Department $5,000 Australian to buy back HMAS Whyalla, $5,000 Australian, less than the price of a second-hand car in 1984. After her decommissioning on the 16th of May, 1946, HMAS Whyalla had been sold to the Victorian Public Works Department, renamed the RIP, used as a lighthouse tender working the entrance of Port Phillip Bay. For 38 years, she had served as the RIP, the corvette that had survived the Sydney Harbour midget submarine attack of 1942, the dive bombing in McLaren Harbour in 1943, and the Okinawa campaign of 1945, was now ferrying lighthouse keepers in and out of Port Phillip. Late 1984, 11 Whyalla volunteers crew her on the voyage home from Williamstown to Spencer Gulf, a 2,400-kilometre journey under her own steam, down Bass Strait, across the Great Australian Bight, around the southern coast of Eyre Peninsula, into Spencer Gulf, home. April 1987. She is dragged 2 kilometres inland on a specially built rolling cradle pulled by D9 bulldozers. The road through Whyalla is closed for 3 days. The Lincoln Highway is rebuilt around her. She is raised 2 metres off the ground on steel supports. The whole improbable journey, the corvette dragged across the saltbush, the cradle creaking, the bulldozers smoking, was documented in real time by a Whyalla News cartoonist who signed his work, Stunt Stephen Stanley, drew the corvette's progress week by week from 1984 to 1987. His cartoons were later collected in a book the town christened The Reluctant Lady, published in conjunction with an exhibition of the original cartoons mounted on board the ship itself. Stanley is the named local who turned the corvette's return into the city's memory. 29th of October 1988, the Whyalla Maritime Museum opens around her. The future curator, Paul Mazurek. Behind the corvette, the BHP Whyalla steelworks kept smoking. The blast furnaces ran. The rolling mill ran. The harbour still loaded iron ore for export, much of it to Japan. But the slipways were silent. The fitting-out wharf was silent. The plate shop, the frame shop, the foundry, silent. 1981. Blast furnace number 1 closed. 1990s, BHP rationalises its Whyalla operations. The Newcastle Steelworks closes in 1999. Whyalla survives. 28th of October 2000. BHP demerges its long products steel business. One Steel Limited is created, taking the Whyalla Steelworks, the Whyalla Harbour, the Iron Knob iron ore mine and the Middleback Range mines. ASX listed October 2000. And by 2012, the BHP successor company at Whyalla had been renamed twice and was about to go bankrupt. Chapter 11. The Arium Administration. 2nd of July 2012. One Steel Limited, renamed Arium Limited. The Australian steel industry through the 2010s was structurally failing. Cheap Chinese steel imports, collapsed margins, a high Australian dollar, a federal carbon tax that Tony Abbott had famously warned would create a Whyalla wipeout. The carbon tax was repealed in 2014. The wipeout came anyway, from somewhere else. 7th of April 2016, Arium Limited placed in voluntary administration. Administrators, Corda-Mentha. Debts, more than 4 billion Australian dollars. Corda-Mentha's evidence to the Senate inquiry on the 6th of April 2016. Steel prices reduced by 60% since 2012, steel margins over scrap reduced by 80%. Whyalla workforce at administration, approximately 3,000. The administration process ran 17 months. The 1st of September 2017. Liberty. House Group and GFG Alliance, controlled by Sanjeev Gupta, acquires Arium Mining and Arium Steel from the administrators. Arium Mining renamed Simek Mining. 1. Steel Manufacturing. The Whyalla operation, renamed Liberty One Steel. The Whyalla workforce took a 10% pay cut as part of the acquisition deal. December 2017. Gupta announces a $1 billion Australian dollars transformation plan for Whyalla. Green steel, hydrogen, renewable energy, the future. Financial year 2018. One Steel Manufacturing loses 195 million Australian dollars. Sanjeev Gupta, Indian-born British metallurgist, born 1971 in Punjab, India. Trinity College, Cambridge graduate, London-based, a member of the global commodity trading elite who, in 2016 and 2017, had positioned himself as the saviour of distressed Western steel assets. Liberty Steel had acquired plants in the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, the Czech Republic, Romania, the United States, and now Australia. Gupta arrived in Whyalla in 2017, promising a green steel future for the city. He was photographed at the steelworks gate in a hard hat. The Whyalla News ran the photograph across 2 pages. The headline, New Hope for Steel City. He was the saviour. And in London, in March 2021, the financial scaffolding that propped up Sanjeev Gupta's global steel empire collapsed. Read that name again. Sanjeev Gupta, the London metallurgist, the saviour, the owner of Whyalla. Chapter 12. Greensill, Gupta and the 15-minute bill. 8th of March 2021. Greensill capital collapses. Lex Greensill, Australian-born financier, founder of Greensill Capital, headquartered in London and Bundaberg, Queensland. Greensill's firm's exposure to GFG Alliance at the moment of collapse totalled approximately $5 billion. Credit Suisse withdrew £7 billion of funds, citing concerns about Gupta exposure. May 2022, the United Kingdom's Serious Fraud Office launches a criminal investigation in the SFO's own published wording, suspected fraud, fraudulent trading and money laundering in relation to the financing and conduct of the business of companies within the Gupta Family Group Alliance, including its financing arrangements with Greensill Capital UK Limited. Read that again. Suspected fraud, fraudulent trading, money laundering. The owner of Whyalla. Through 2022, 2023 and 2024, Whyalla blast furnace operations became erratic. Workers went unpaid for weeks. The blast furnace was down for approximately 8 months in 2024. On the shop floor, the AMW organiser at Whyalla, Stephen McMillan, told InDaily in May 2024 that the steelworkers had absorbed wage cuts as the cooled furnace reduced shifts by 30%. The men who had run the blast furnaces under BHP, One Steel, Arium and now Liberty were watching their paychecks shrink in real time. The political voice for Whyalla in the South Australian Parliament was the apprentice from Chapter 5. Eddie Hughes, the 17-year-old who had walked through the BHP gate in 1973, the 22-year-old who had crossed the road to the steelworks when Iron Curtis launched, had spent 2 decades on the Whyalla City Council. In March 2014, he succeeded Lynn Brewer as member for Giles in the South Australian House of Assembly. 11 years later, on the 19th of February 2025, he was on the floor of the House as the Whyalla Steelworks Act amendment passed in 15 minutes. The apprentice voted to seize the steelworks back. Sanjeev Gupta asked by the industry press what the blast furnace downtime was costing him. $1 million Australian dollars per day. By early 2025, GFG owed Whyalla more than 300 million Australian dollars, including 15 million Australian dollars to SA Water. The 19th of February 2025, the South Australian Parliament under Premier Peter Malinauskas of the Labor Party amends the Whyalla Steel Works Act 1958 in approximately 15 minutes. Read that again. 15 minutes. A piece of legislation drafted overnight by the Crown Solicitor's Office, voted through both houses of the South Australian Parliament before lunch. Cordar Mentha, the same administrators who had managed the 2016 Arium collapse, were reappointed. The 20th of February 2025, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Premier Peter Malinauskas and Industry Minister Ed Husic announce a $2.4 billion Australian dollars joint federal-state rescue package, $384 million Australian dollars for operations during administration, $1.9 billion Australian dollars for future infrastructure, including $500 million Australian dollars from a new Commonwealth Green Iron Investment Fund. Premier Malinauskas on the day. I was never going to allow a taxpayer-funded bailout of GFG, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, the same union that had stood with Stuart Gordon, AMWU organiser, on the platform at the 2017 GFG handover in Ada Ryan Gardens, was now welcoming the seizure back. National Secretary Steve Murphy. This will shape the hopes of blue-collar workers across the country. The Whyalla Steelworks in 2025, 1,100 direct employees, approximately 2,000 indirect employees. Stand on the Lincoln Highway today. The corvette HMAS Whyalla is still there. The blast furnace is still smoking, and the city of 33,000 has become a city of 21,000. Chapter 13. What 66 ships built stand on the Lincoln Highway into Whyalla today. 2 kilometres before you reach the city centre, the corvette HMAS Whyalla sits beached, 2 metres off the ground, 2 kilometres from the sea. 56 metres of grey steel hull. 3 battle honours: Pacific from 1942 to 1945, New Guinea from 1942 to 1944, Okinawa 1945. The Whyalla Maritime Museum surrounds her, opened on the 29th of October 1988. Behind her, 4 kilometres south, the BHP, then One Steel, then Arium, then Liberty. Now administrator-managed Whyalla Steelworks still smokes. Blast furnace number 2 is still in operation. 1,100 direct employees, 2,000 indirect. The city's population is 21,000. The slipways where the corvette was built in 1941, where Iron Curtis was launched in 1978, are empty. The 5 slipways that built 66 ships across 37 years are gravel and saltbush. Roy Kriegler died many years ago. Essington Lewis died at his property at Tungkilo on the 2nd of October 1961, 8 years before the shipyard reached its commercial peak. Mr. Kleeman, the founding superintendent, is long gone. Ross Hawke, who ran the yard through the peak, is long gone. Peter Stanley lives in Canberra and writes the history. Stephen Stanley still draws cartoons. Lynn Brewer is the city's senior elder stateswoman. Eddie Hughes still represents Whyalla in Parliament. Paul Mazurek still runs the Maritime Museum. Sanjeev Gupta is in London. The UK Serious Fraud Office investigation into fraud, fraudulent trading and money laundering is ongoing in 2026. The Whyalla Steelworks is in the hands of administrators. Eddie Hughes still walks through the BHP gate. Lesson 1. A shipyard without orders is a shipyard without a country. In 1941, HMAS Whyalla was built at Whyalla because Australia needed corvettes. In 1978, Iron Curtis was built at Whyalla because BHP still needed a coal carrier. Between those 2 ships, the Whyalla yard built 64 others: corvettes, freighters, ore carriers, tankers, an oil rig, the world's first gas turbine electric-powered ship. But by 1975, half of the world's commercial shipbuilding came out of Japan. By 1976, the Fraser government had commissioned the Industries Assistance Commission to ask whether Australia could compete. The answer was no. The Whyalla yard could build ships. It could not sell them. And a shipyard without orders is a shipyard without a country. Lesson 2. Foreign ownership is not the same as foreign investment. In 2017, the Whyalla Steelworks was sold to Sanjeev Gupta's GFG Alliance. The promise? A green steel future, a transformed industrial city, a London-backed billionaire who would do for Whyalla what BHP had done for Newcastle. The reality? By 2025, the South Australian Parliament had to pass legislation in 15 minutes to seize the steelworks back. The federal and state governments committed $2.4 billion to keep it running. And the UK Serious Fraud Office was investigating the owner for fraud, fraudulent trading and money laundering. Foreign ownership is not the same as foreign investment. One brings capital, the other extracts it. Lesson 3. The patriotic debt has a geography. In 1942, HMAS Whyalla escorted Allied convoys through the Coral Sea and the Bismarck Sea. In 1945, she was at Okinawa with the British Pacific Fleet. The men who built her were South Australian, working on a shipyard that had not existed 3 years earlier, on a coast where the town's population was barely 5,000. 84 years later, the corvette they built sits beached 2 kilometres inland, the last physical memory of a yard that closed in 1978, and a city that has lost 1 in 3 of its residents since 1976. The patriotic debt of from 1941 to 1945 was repaid in the slipways, the foundries and the wartime corvettes. The repayment by the country those ships defended has been across the 80 years since. 1,800 redundancies in 1978, 3 corporate ownership changes between 2000 and 2017, an Indian-British metallurgist between 2017 and 2025, and an emergency $2.4 billion package in February 2025. The patriotic debt has a geography, and the geography is Whyalla. The Lincoln Highway runs east from Port Augusta to Whyalla. 2 kilometres before the city, the corvette HMAS Whyalla sits beached on dry land. 56 metres of grey steel hull. 3 battle honours, the first of 66, built in May 1941. Bought back for $5,000 in 1984. Moved 2 kilometres inland in 1987. Drawn by Stan, surrounded by a museum in 1988. Behind her, the blast furnace still smokes. The 1,100 steel workers still clock on. The 33,000 of 1976 has become 21,000. The 5 slipways are gravel and saltbush. The corvette HMU Whyalla, the first ship built at Whyalla, the literal first hull, is the last monument of a yard that built 66. Sanjeev Gupta is still in London. The blast furnace is still smoking. Eddie Hughes still walks through the BHP gate. Built strong. Built at Whyalla. Built to last. The corvette survives. The shipyard does not.